Hey, Feisty podcast listeners. Sara Gross here, founder and CEO of Feisty Media. Before we get started on today's episode, I just wanted to jump in here and tell you about the special deal we are running for Feisty fans and podcast listeners for our new course, Brain Power, which is an expansion of the podcast series you are listening to. The course is designed to give you deep understanding about how the brain works and how we can help keep it working through all stages of life. Inside, you will learn how your brain and hormones interact to impact mood, motivation, performance, and recovery, how stress affects your brain, perhaps one of the most useful parts for me, and the course gives you tools to manage that stress before you burn out or find yourself in cognitive decline. You'll learn about the impact of neurodiversity and mental health, how to protect your brain and ensure long-term brain health, how to build a personalized toolkit for brain resilience using movement, nutrition, mindfulness, and smart recovery. So, as you're listening to the podcast, if you think you want to dive in deeper and learn more on some of the topics that are discussed, make sure you take advantage of our pre-sale $50 discount on the Brain Power course. The course will officially drop in June, and this pre-sale is the very best price you will get. For more information or to buy the course, you'll find the link in the show notes of this episode. And now, on to the show. Hello again, Feisty friends. I am here with our very favorite sports psychologist, Dr. Erin Ayala. Hi, Erin.
Hello, happy to be here. How are you?
So good, so good. Recording this series with you, for those who don't know, this is the fourth part of a four-part series that we're calling Brain Power, which goes along with our new online course at Feisty, also called Brain Power. And it's just been so fun to record with you. The interviews have been incredible. And people listening, if you haven't listened to the first three parts, definitely go back and listen to them. But also, if you like them, and if you're one of those people who came up to me and said, Sara, I love the brain episodes, definitely go leave us a review. Or if you hated it and you want to leave us a review, we're also open to that too. But
yes, if you have feedback,
if you have feedback, let us know. It really does help also like boost our podcast into the podcast algorithms, the forces that be. So really appreciate everyone who's listening. And Erin, we have another really great episode coming up.
We do. So we have our final guest is Laura Best. Laura has a PhD in medical science from the University of Toronto. She did her dissertation and PhD work on neuroimaging of the brain and addiction. And then now she's bringing that more into, it's called the Women's Brain Health Initiative. And they're doing a lot of really great work on supporting brain health for women, especially millennials, saying it's never too early to start focusing on this. So she's now on the West Coast at University of British Columbia doing more research there.
Yeah, this interview is very... it's really an excellent cap on all of the rest of the interviews. I've really enjoyed Laura's enthusiasm for the topic.
She's so passionate about it. I mean, we talk about how cognitive decline can start earlier than expected. I think often we think about our later years, and she's like, no, it actually starts happening sooner, and that's normal. But what does that look like, and how do you pay attention to it, right? So we kind of talked about overall health in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and then talking about like why this is a really important topic for healthy women and health-conscious women.
Yeah, and I think, and part of what we're trying to achieve here too is just this idea that we spend so much time thinking about our physical health, and how we look.
Yes.
And I think, oh my goodness, like if there's anything I want to keep into as I age is my mental capacity, my cognitive capacity. Like these things are so important, and I think we need to prioritize that as much as or more than anything else. So just all of this learning has been so amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of really great takeaways for this one, so we hope folks enjoy it. Okay, welcome, Laura. We are so excited to have you here. Thanks for getting up early in Pacific time. Anyway, I'm in Central, so you're a couple hours ahead of me. We have the final episode, final conversation. This is going to be really fun to round this out. So maybe we start by hearing a little bit about who you are, kind of what you do, and how that's relevant to brain health.
Totally. Thank you so much for having me, Erin. It's lovely to be here. Honestly, I've just always been someone who loves learning and loves the brain. It's such a fascinating organ. And the more that I've learned, the more I know that it's so interconnected with all of us and the whole of who we are. It's incredible. So I got my PhD in medical science at the University of Toronto back in 2021. It was actually focused more on neuroimaging and mental health, which has always been such a passion of mine. And then during that, I went on a bit of a side quest and got my yoga teaching training and got really into mindfulness and meditation, really wanting to learn about that from the, of course, historic, cultural standpoint, acknowledging that it's such an ancient, beautiful practice, but then also curious about the effects of it on the brain and how it can really be used as a tool to help us be the best person we can be in all senses of the word. And then recently I've moved from East Coast Canada, Ontario in Canada, to the West Coast and here in BC, again, as a student, a forever student in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. I think one of the most influential pieces on my love of the brain has been also my involvement with a Canadian charitable organization, Women's Brain Health Initiative. For almost a decade, I've sat on their young professionals board, the Brain Suite Social Cabinet, and have learned so much through that involvement as well. So just all areas of my life have always incorporated my love of the brain and love of learning.
Very cool. It's such an important topic, as you know. I mean, we've been talking a lot about, we talk about, bone health, and we talk about overall, mental health, physical health, fitness, especially for active women as we're aging. But I have yet to hear active conversations for women of all ages about brain health. So it's really cool to have you on and to start to unpack some of this. So if you were to talk to, a family member, friend, and kind of they asked you the question, what is brain health? How might you answer that? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, what is brain health? It's such a good question because it's such a general term, right? We often think of, hey, you've got mental health, your emotional well-being, your cognitive well-being. How does your brain interface with your body and your environment on a day-to-day basis? So I guess that's kind of what I think of when I think of brain health, is how is it that your brain is interfacing with everything else that it needs to interface with, and is it doing that well? So including cognitive health, including mental health, including physical health, and the coordination, because the brain is the coordinating center, right? So is your body functioning optimally because your brain is working optimally? It's all interconnected. And then, of course, classically, we think of when we think of the absence of brain health, we're thinking of mental health conditions. We're also thinking of neurodegenerative disorders like dementia, like Parkinson's, like strokes and vascular disease. So I think of the brain as really encompassing so much of who we are physically and hold the space for us to be more than that,
Fascinating. I don't think I've shared this yet. I did a rotation when I was a PhD student out of my final year of training in a movement disorders clinic at an academic medical center. And so I worked with a lot of folks with Parkinson's. And my supervisor offered to have me come in and watch an open brain surgery. And I was like, when in my life am I ever going to have the opportunity to do something like this again? And that it blew my mind. It was so cool to see all of the physicians in the room. And in this case, it was for, electrical stimulation for someone with Parkinson's and dropping the lead into the basal ganglia. And it was phenomenal. And that, I think, for me was a really big moment where I was able to see all of these things connecting and how interconnected they actually are, right?
Absolutely. Those are the most fascinating surgeries. I've also seen a few, and they're just incredible.
Yes. And the way for anyone actually, do you want to explain what it is? Because you'll likely do a better job than I can for anyone listening who's not familiar with it.
I mean, the idea is that, and actually the surgery is being expanded now and trialed for different conditions, sometimes like treatment-resistant depression. But the idea is that if there is a specific area of your brain that we can localize what's going wrong to, and things like medications, movement, therapy, things like that aren't solving the problem or aren't helpful. One of the ways they can basically insert an electrode into this very specific part of the brain and use electrical impulses to override or change the activity that's going on in that area and hopefully be able to offer some kind of relief. And in these surgeries, there's so many people involved. Neurosurgeons, electrophysiologists, like just experts on experts, and they're all there to try and find the optimal placement of that electrode. And it's this little trial and error, because of course you don't want it in the wrong place and have wrong effects. And these surgeries can be life-changing for people. It's really incredible. Yeah.
They can completely stop tremors for folks with Parkinson's and other movement disorders. I mean, it was fascinating watching the brain activity on the screen and waking the patient up from anesthesia in the middle of a surgery, telling them to say certain things and move certain limbs to make sure, again, that placement was perfect, right?
Exactly.
So I joked when we first started talking, we could go down rabbit holes. So that was a great one. So I think one thing we often talk about, though, is this idea of like brain health for aging. I think one big part of the conversation that's often neglected unintentionally is brain health in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, and what we can do as early adults and then mid-career adults to protect our brains and cognitive decline, for example. So in what ways are our health habits, both the adaptive and maladaptive, the great and not so great habits, affecting our brain function over time? I know it's a really broad question.
I was like, that is a huge question, Erin, but I'm here for it. So I guess the first thing to acknowledge is that this idea of cognitive decline is happening earlier than we think. You were saying before, we talk so much about bone health. We talk so much like all of these different types of health. Like in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, we are so worried about wrinkles and skincare and developing a skincare routine. And I'm like, at that same time, we need to be having a brain health routine. And the cool thing about it is that so much of the lifestyle decisions that we make in our 20s, 30s, and 40s can prime our brains for better cognitive health later in life. The thing about brain health is that it is this unique interplay of genetics, environment, individual choices, right? It's multifactorial. We talk about this all the time with the brain. Nothing is simple. But there is a piece of it that is in our control, and lifestyle things. This is one of the biggest things I've learned from the charity that I work with, Women's Brain Health Initiative. They've developed this idea of the 6 pillars of brain health to essentially help promote good brain health later in life and good cognition later in life, right? And so these are things like sleep and good nutrition and exercise are some of them, to name a few. And then, of course, as I know you talked about on a previous podcast, stress and chronic stress, lack of quality sleep are huge ones that can really hinder brain health, right? Or increase the risk for poor cognitive function and dementia. Sleep is such an interesting one because you can be sleeping many hours, but if you're waking up in the morning and still feeling tired, the quality of the sleep is really what matters. We had, I recently did a deep dive into sleep physiology and really just learning all the intricacies of sleep. It is complex. And we can talk about it later in the resources section, but there's a fantastic book that really talks about some of these intricacies of sleep that I've really enjoyed.
Yeah. And that's
so I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's a great overview. I mean, I think, Jill Colangelo and I were talking a little bit about this kind of hustle culture a few episodes back and how this kind of like, I'll sleep when I'm dead like, yeah, you will. And how's life going to be in the meantime? Like, how can we really set ourselves up for success as opposed to kind of going along for this ride with this hustle culture, this rise and grind, as opposed to being able to say, like, no, this is a non-negotiable for me.
Totally. You sleep
whenever
when you're dead. Well, when will that be if you're not taking care of
Yes.
your brain?
So much earlier, right?
Yep. Probably.
So then what does that look like? It's like, so let's say someone is neglecting those 6 pillars. How is that going to affect them? What might be some of the signs or symptoms that their brain is not, firing on all cylinders per se?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question because the brain is so good at compensating. So that's part of the struggle, if you will, is that your brain can be functioning quite well, and you may not see symptoms or signs while the actual pathology or things that are going wrong, the small infarcts that are developing in your brain over time of because of poor habits, you might not notice them until it's too late, right?
Sure.
And so often in neuroscience and in medicine, when you're exhibiting symptoms, it's often like, you're like, okay, I see it now. I'm going to make changes. But it's ideal to think about it before that. Prevention is really the strongest medicine.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, if we're talking about sort of normal aging and normal, what to expect normally and what normal changes happen in the brain versus, something that may be abnormal, we know that with time, the brain does atrophy. So when we think of the brain, it's made up of, 86 billion or something neurons and cells that are connected. And then there's space between those neurons, and there's fluid in the brain, and all of those things encompass what we think of as brain mass and the supportive cells that support the brain and keep it going. And so brain mass, we know, does shrink over the lifespan. That is just normal. We see it on brain imaging. There are things that cause that to accelerate, things like alcohol use. We know that when there's chronic alcohol use over time or development of an alcohol use disorder, brain atrophy beyond what we would expect as normal is what happens. Dementia as well. We see targeted areas that are reduced in size and therefore function in the hippocampus, for example, when we're thinking of things related to memory. So there's a normal amount of brain shrinkage or brain atrophy, and then there's associated with diseases beyond that. Sure. When you think of cognitive functioning, so, okay, let's back up. What is cognition? Cognition, we can think of as anything like attention, memory, perception. So the way in which you are noticing and interpreting the world around you. Reasoning, planning, problem solving, decision making, all of those things that you do on a day-to-day basis essentially is cognition. And that's those higher order processes, right? And we know that over time there is some normal level of cognitive slowing, but what is abnormal is when there is a change so much so that it's affecting your day-to-day functioning.
Sure.
So those activities that you think of that you need to do to live, eating, using the bathroom, dressing yourself, like all of those things, if that's being impacted by cognitive decline, that's not normal.
I think about that from a mental health lens because often, as a psychologist, it's like, at what point does anxiety become problematic? At what point do depressive symptoms become problematic, or, attention deficit disorder? Like there are all of these things. And often what we look at is, to what extent is it getting in the way of day-to-day functioning? Yeah. Because it's normal for humans to have depressive symptoms once in a while. That's just, it's a part of the ride. It's part of life. It's normal for us to be anxious. Yes. Especially before important moments or opportunities or things we care a lot about. Yeah. But at what point does that anxiety start to get in the way? For sure. Bone health, you could use a similar analogy, is right. Like as we age, it's typical for us to see a decrease in like bone density, for example, but it doesn't have to be problematic, especially if we're taking preventative routes needed to maintain that health, right?
Exactly.
So that's a brilliant...
Falling and putting your hand, you know what I mean? There's different levels of normal. And I think it's just the bet, like as humans, we have a range of what is normal. We have uniqueness that is normal to each of us, right? And so it's when you see that change. And so then I think of, okay, we've got athletes, we've got people who are maybe, or scientists, different people who are performing at different levels. And so then it's always important to think about, well, is that a change for this person?
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. What do you think are some of the common like challenges and then also just opportunities that women experience when it comes to brain health?
I mean, so often women are, and you know what, I think there's also an opportunity to think about people who identify as women and take on roles that are classically sort of gender associated. And then we've also got unique experiences of people who are biologically female. And that sort of interplay, distinction, spectrum, I also think is really interesting.
That makes sense.
And important to take into account. And so thinking of things, I mean, an active woman who is maybe a high-level athlete, training a lot, you know, they've got their movement practices down pat. They are doing that, and they've incorporated that into their brain health routine because it's a part of their life. And then likely good nutrition, fuel is already something that they're noticing and paying attention to, right? Sometimes we know that those who identify as women are often more impacted by stress and experience more and chronic stress, are more likely to be in caregiving roles, which we know are extremely stressful and stress-inducing, and can impact the amount that someone is able to sleep. If there's other challenges, possibly socioeconomic challenges, or someone is experiencing inequities, that also can impact their ability to engage with brain health routines and these things that we think of like the diet, the fuel piece. That's something that is such a privilege to be able to access as well. So there are really all of these factors that when I think of the unique sort of challenges that some women and females might be experiencing, those are some of them. And then of course we always want to talk about with biologically female individuals, the effects of hormones and fluctuating hormones over the course of a month, over the course of their life. We know that estrogen and the presence of estrogen is supportive for many aspects of brain health and cognition. And so then when you hit menopause and all of a sudden you're at this sort of deficit of hormones, which I know you've talked about in a past podcast episode, then there's so many more instances of brain fog, of some cognitive decline that can be really impairing for many people. And that they find jarring because it is this fairly stark change from what they were experiencing before.
Yeah, Dr. Carla DiGirolamo has talked about that as like, yes, it's common, it's typical, it's quote unquote normal, but it doesn't have to be your experience, right?
Absolutely.
Just because you're having that decline or the brain fog or all of these symptoms doesn't mean that you just have to push through it. Like there are treatments, there are approaches to help you with those symptoms. Right?
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
I also think about the kind of the interplay about how I work with a lot of teen girls, all athletes, and how puberty affects their performance, and then how the stress of being a high schooler in today's day and age is also likely coming into play there. And then I also think about just diet culture and fueling, especially 100%. As they often hit puberty, then they often experience this plateau with performance, especially in endurance sports, because their body is changing. It's getting used to having more adipose fat tissue and and the menstrual cycle and all of these things. And then they may unintentionally start to or intentionally eat less in order to try to be faster when they're not actually helping themselves. And that is likely also affecting their ability to concentrate and use all that glycogen for their brain so that they can think and study, right?
100%.
So it's all connected.
100%. I mean, one of my favorite things to think about that was shocking is how little body mass the brain actually takes up. I think it's like 2% maybe or something. And yet it accounts for at least 20 to 25% of your energy consumption.
Wow.
And so that is so disproportionate. And then, you talk about, okay, in the instances where maybe there is underfueling for what your body needs to do to perform. And of course, the body has all of these very cool mechanisms that try to preserve all of that glucose and nutrients and oxygen to go to the brain, but it can only do so much, right?
That makes sense. Yeah.
And then I also think about how so much of the research and the knowledge and the guidelines that have been developed for years have traditionally and historically been based on studies done in men. And often, men of a certain affluence or men of a certain racial background. And so the applicability of all the guidelines and research that is out there may not apply to all women and of all ages. And I just think that's it's something that has been identified for sure. And people are talking so much more about it now. And research over the past decade, even, I'm seeing such a shift in the focus on trying to include so many different perspectives and types of people so that the information can be applicable, because everybody deserves this sort of chance to take on and feel empowered in their own brain health journey.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any, is it still too early, or are there any trends in the research that you're able to speak to on gender differences and brain health? I know you spoke a little bit about menopause, for example, and different levels of, how the hormonal health can then also affect brain health.
Well, my PhD was mainly focused on alcohol use disorder and other substance use disorders. So one of the things we know is that alcohol definitely affects women differently than men. It's also, there's also social and cultural pieces that play a part in that. When you look at the prevalence of alcohol use disorder, or sort of the term for more colloquially like an alcohol addiction, it tends to be more prevalent in men. But there are differences in how it shows up in women and the escalation happens in women. Some of that has to do with physiology, with having more a different ratio of water content in the body, which affects the absorption of alcohol and the metabolism of alcohol. There's differences in just sort of the mass to alcohol consumption ratio in men and women. But what we have seen is that women, from the initiation of sort of drinking alcohol, and if they are to drink in a more high risk pattern, women are quicker to develop the negative consequences from alcohol use compared to men. And so that includes a much quicker development of alcohol use disorder as being one risk for women. And so it can kind of feel like it comes out of nowhere. And all of a sudden they're experiencing this. And of course, alcohol use disorder really doesn't have anything to do with how much alcohol someone's drinking, but the impact that it's having on their life, right? So going back to that idea of functioning, how is this affecting your functioning?
Yep. Interesting. Okay. That's fascinating.
I know there's also differences in prevalence of things like dementia. 70% of those who have dementia identify as women, which is a huge disproportion. And so there's a lot of research going into why that may be the case. Again, I keep coming back to this charity that I've worked with, but they just do such incredible things, and they fund sex and gender focused research, neuroscience research. So it's cool to see the shift happening.
Yep.
It's there.
I'm seeing more too as a sports psychologist in concussions. And the focus on gender differences and trying to get a better understanding of why female athletes may be more vulnerable or susceptible to experiencing concussions. And then even how that can inform strength training and things like that moving forward to help us protect our brains in those of us who may be in high impact sports or sports that have a higher likelihood of experiencing concussion, right?
Yeah, very cool. As someone who's had some concussions myself, I appreciate that research.
Right? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. How about let's dive into some myths and some facts. What do you think? And I've got a few that I can run by you. But before I do, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that you've come across in terms of brain health?
I mean, we've sort of touched on the biggest one already, is that like cognitive decline only happens in older age.
When does it start?
It can start in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. It depends on a lot of different things, right? There are certain types of dementia that actually, this is a great opportunity. Let's talk about the difference between mild cognitive impairment and sort of them. So mild cognitive impairment is where you start to experience cognitive decline, and it's affecting some levels of functioning.
Sure.
But not to sort of the big detrimental impact that we see. And then from there, that can develop into different types of dementia, Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, etc. But it can be viewed on a spectrum. There's also opportunity to intervene, right, at any of these points, which is the other cool thing about the brain, is that it is malleable to some extent, right? So
let's actually, before we go into that, because I know we will both nerd out over this for sure, what might be some examples of kind of normative cognitive decline or mild cognitive impairment? So I'm thinking about people who might usually be really good at names, and all of a sudden they're having a hard time remembering someone's name, or going to a room and forgetting why they went there. Like what other symptoms or examples can you think of for what might be termed mild cognitive impairment, where it's starting to be noticeable but not worth freaking out over?
Yeah. I mean, you know what, Erin? I find that to be a really hard distinction, because I think it's so person dependent. I think it's also very environment dependent. I think of times when I've been extremely stressed in life, you've got a lot going on, whether it's work, whether it's family, whether it's all of the above at the same time. And I find I'm more likely to forget where I put my keys, walk into a room and forget what I was doing in there. And that, I think it's all very situation dependent. But I do go back to what's termed as sort of your activities of daily living. And then you also have your independent activities of daily living. And those are, again, the basic needs. Are you able to feed yourself? Are you able to food prep? Are you able to shop for that food prep? Are you able to complete chores, transport, ambulate, walk around your home? Those kinds of things. Those are the big pieces of functioning that really take it from maybe a mild cognitive decline or impairment into that more serious category. But the idea is to start paying attention, right? I mean, if you start noticing that some of those pieces of, I'm forgetting things I didn't used to forget before. I am making mistakes. I am not as coordinated movement-wise. I lose my train of thought, can't find words. And it's not just slower, but it's not happening. That's when I think it's great to talk to a healthcare provider. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And best case scenario, you go in and they say, no, everything looks good. Don't worry about it. But that's, I think those kinds of clues are really important to pick up on so that you can start making little changes as early as possible. Don't wait until it's, impairing your functioning to a point that you're really, really struggling.
Yeah. So then you said the brain can change. So how? People talk a lot about neuroplasticity. Like, what is that?
Yeah.
And then for someone who might be experiencing mild cognitive impairment or some little kind of warning signs, how can they reverse it? And how so? And how does that work? Another loaded question for you.
Big loaded question. Neuroplasticity. I love neuroplasticity. And there's some really good books. Again, we can talk about at the end.
Awesome.
For anyone who's interested in neuroplasticity. But it really is the idea. We used to think, we as in society, used to think that when the brain developed from childhood to adulthood and you were done growing, so was your brain, right? It was sort of, it is as it is. That's it. Use it or lose it. Well, actually, that's kind of also still applicable, but we'll get to that. Neuroplasticity, the idea is that your brain can adapt to your environment and what it's doing and what it's exposed to. And when I think of this, I kind of think of a highway versus an old logging road. You know, the old logging road, it is dirt path. It is maybe wide enough for your car, maybe not. It's not well traveled. It really takes some effort to get down that road, but it's there. And then you've got your highways, your 4-lane, your 5-lane, your 6-lane in some case highways. And as long as there's no rush hour traffic, you are getting down that highway pretty quickly. And it is the most traveled route, and you get more cars down that route. And so
the most efficient.
100%, right? And that's what I think of when I think of neurons in the brain. And so at its most basic level, neuroplasticity is the ability for neurons to change and adapt in their connections to one another, and therefore for information to travel in different ways in the brain. And the most efficient pathways, the ones most frequently used, are going to be the strongest connections, like your highways, and they're also going to be the most automatic connections. So that's when we think of athletes, muscle memory, the idea that you're repeating something over and over and over, habit building over and over, commitment to that same thing is going to make it easier for your brain to kick into that pathway, that activity, and complete it. And then that though changes, right? Over time. Use it or lose it is also sort of a phrase that can be applied here. And that's why practice makes perfect. And all of these things that we've heard all of our lives really just are rooted in neuroplasticity and learning in the brain when it works well and when it's, healthy.
Yep. Interesting. I've used an analogy before of, and I've used it in the context of like mindfulness meditation. So being from the North, which you'll appreciate this, the other Canadians will appreciate this, is, going sledding. And the first time you go down the hill, it's going to be pretty rough. There's going to be fresh powder flying in your face. It's going to be bumpy, like you don't have a clear route. And it takes a lot more effort. You may not get down the whole hill. and then over time, you keep going down that same path and it's going to be faster and faster and smoother and easier, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's like, it's fun to have those analogies because I think it's, Sara Gross and I were talking about how a lot of this stuff can feel so complicated and overwhelming. And so then when you're able to bring in these day-to-day analogies, it's so much easier to be like, oh, that makes sense. That's how it works.
Absolutely.
Right? How about brain health in genetics versus environment and/or versus like personal health habits and decisions? So to what extent do genetics come into play with brain health, and then the environment that we're in that we don't have control over, and then the things that we do have control over?
Again, not one answer. Always with the brain, right? But we know that there are some genetic mutations or genetic anomalies that can predispose somebody to being at greater risk of developing things like dementia, Parkinson's, cognitive decline. And that's where family history is so important. Another one that's really, we haven't talked much about it today, but the impact of cardiovascular health on brain health is huge, right? Reducing risk of things like strokes specifically is absolutely imperative to maintain your brain health, because it's its most fundamental piece. Like, a stroke is impairing your brain or parts of your brain from getting that oxygen and glucose it needs to function.
Right.
And small or large infarct like that can accumulate over time and really have a big effect on things like cognition and brain health. And so we know cardiovascular risk really runs in families. And so that's, I would say, we can't modify our genetics, and it's important for those who want to know, some people don't want to know, but it's important to sort of understand, if you want, what you might be at greater risk for, and then where you can pay attention and put your efforts towards minimizing or almost counterbalancing those risks with the lifestyle decisions that you're making. And that's where the empowerment piece comes in, right? We can't change our genetics, but we can change the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. And I find a lot of empowerment in that personally.
Yeah.
You know, it's really motivating to know that that can have an effect.
Right.
And so it's sort of the things that we talked about before. Nutrition, lots of research into the Mediterranean diet. We hear it all the time. And then what's known as the MIND diet, which is super similar to the Mediterranean diet. But it's like lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, legumes, nuts, fish as a protein source, minimizing things like alcohol, red meat. But at the end of the day, when thinking about all of these things, building balance is so important. And I'm sure you have lots to talk about on that sort of moderation and building sustainable habits that you find fulfilling is so much more important than trying to stick to this routine that is grueling and difficult and upsetting. And then I think
being too restrictive, like 100%. At what point does that, like creating these really rigid rules that saying, I need to do this because this is important for my brain.
100%.
Like, well, like what are the costs of being too rigid with this? And what might you be missing out on as a result? That makes sense.
Totally. And does that cause you stress, right? Over time, does being that restrictive impose more of a stress response and chronic stress, which we also know is deteriorating over time. So it's a cool thing to think about the fact that there are all these factors that can help and play a role. And it does mean that sort of whatever small differences you can make, it has an impact over time. It is cumulative and you get to choose the path that is best for you. And I think we were mentioning environment pieces. There are things that about the environment that is out of our control or out of someone's control, right? And I think, again, it's about leaning into what you can control.
Right.
Yeah. And acknowledging that nothing is perfect. No one is perfect. And a life, there's so much emphasis on preserve your cognition, but also why do you want to preserve your cognition? You want to preserve your cognition because you're enjoying the life you have.
Right. So you can live.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that I think is a really important perspective to always hold is that keep in mind what it is that you want to preserve and why, and make sure that all of those things are in balance so that you can live a longer life that you like living.
I'm curious, since you have started learning about the brain and really diving into some of this, in what ways have you changed or prioritized your approach to brain health? For example, I mean, especially PhD student life can be really stressful. Like I think sleep, exercise, nutrition, stress levels, kind of what are you doing to optimize or maintain or prioritize your own brain health?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Erin, and something that looks different all the time, which is maybe against the idea of habit building, but
life is always changing. Like as a sports psychologist, I say, sometimes I'm really great at mindfulness meditation and I'll have a really great streak going. And then other weeks it just doesn't happen.
100%.
And it's like, I try to practice what I preach and also I'm human. So it's not always going to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that was kind of a big one, being kind to myself about where I'm at. And then also becoming aware of what is it that I need. And so I already sort of talked about one of them, going down that yoga mindfulness journey, becoming a yoga teacher, learning about all of those practices, learning how to sit still and create space to rest, to recover, to let go of that monkey mind that is constantly moving, and sit in where I'm at in that moment, noticing, even learning how to become aware of what it is that I'm feeling or needing in that moment. Like that is a huge one that has shifted for me from the beginning of my journey to now. And it's still a practice that I'm trying to incorporate, but big one. That's a huge one. Other one, the importance of movement. I was completely unaware of when I was working, how much I just moved naturally all day. And then you become a student or you are, now after PhD, scientist, sitting, writing grants, writing papers. Generally, you're sitting, you're looking at a screen, and we know, like, people have said sedentary is the new smoking.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that comes back to cardiovascular health, but also sort of brain health. And so that's a big one, is making sure that I'm incorporating daily movement, whatever that looks like. It doesn't have to be a big, intense workout, whether it's just a walk with my dog or we go to the trails or whatever. But being aware of that and noticing it. Sleep. I'm really focusing on sleep right now.
Yes.
But it's hard.
Yep.
It's hard. So I think those are my three my top three, and the one I'm actively working on right now is sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
As we start to wrap up, are there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you want to touch on?
I think the piece about, we haven't talked a ton about mental stimulation. We talked a little bit about it with neuroplasticity, but that idea that there's also a lot of research showing that keeping your brain engaged is one of the best ways to maintain your brain health. And that links to so many different things. Your brain can be engaged in many different ways, whether it's like engaging in art, like learning a new instrument, or going to a weekly paint class, or learning to knit. There's also learning a new language. It's such a classic one, but it really challenges your brain in a different way. Socially, like making sure that you stay socially connected is one of the biggest pieces. And I think it's something that can be really hard as you get on that grind life you were talking about. And and the last piece, paying attention to your hearing. Hearing loss has actually been one of the things that's most linked with cognitive decline and dementia risk.
Oh, interesting.
And it's so reversible. Put in a hearing aid. You know?
I had no idea. Yeah, that makes sense.
But that, I mean, if you can't hear, it's harder to engage in the same way with the world if you can't hear it and you're used to hearing it your whole life. So that's another big one to sort of pay attention to and something you can do about. So
basically it's saying like people who may experience hearing loss are getting less stimulation on a day-to-day basis as a result of their hearing loss. And
that's
because of that may be linked to cognitive decline.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. That's one of the hypotheses about it. Of course, there's a plethora of other ways it could be linked, but
of course. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. How about, so I know you and I are both nerds when it comes to books, resources, all the things. So for people who want to take a deep dive in learning more about, you mentioned one book for sleep, one for neuroplasticity, any other resources that are kind of your go-to for folks who are interested in learning more?
Totally. So I guess, sleep, it's called Why We Sleep. Really great
Matthew
book.
Walker.
Yes.
That's a good one. Yep. Yep. It's for anyone who it feels intimidating because it's big and you'll be okay. Yeah,
100%.
Yep.
It keeps you engaged. He's very good. Also, you can read it in chunks, a little bit before you go to bed, and then you fall asleep nicely. The Brain That Changes Itself, Norman Doidge. Such a good book on neuroplasticity. Little stories about how neuroplasticity has been incorporated in people's lives.
Very cool.
And it's a really good book. Books on the neuroscience of mindfulness. I mean, for anyone, of course, I have loved going back to some of the classic cultural historic texts on mindfulness and where the practice is based out of. But then if you're looking for more of the science and some of the more modern theories on that, and there's Attending by Ronald Epstein, I think it was, and Breath by James Nestor. Both.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Really good books. And women's health, I love listening to Dr. Jen Gunter. She is a Canadian gynecologist and just absolutely a pleasure to listen to.
She's a riot. Yeah.
And then I guess for anyone interested in really starting to become aware of and build better brain habits, Women's Brain Health Initiative has developed a free mobile app called BrainFit, which actually,
that's awesome.
It's really cool. Available on Android or iOS. And It links with your Apple Watch tracker, which is amazing. And it just, not only does it like allow you to customize what habits you want to build, but it also provides sort of the science and links to where you can learn more about why you're building those habits. And that's across sort of all fronts of brain health. So it's just a really all-encompassing, I've learned a lot from them. And I just want to share it because it's available.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
On that note, how can folks learn more about the Women's Brain Health Initiative? Website, social media, any other ways to get a hold of them or to kind of get a feel for what they're up to these days?
Absolutely. So womensbrainhealth.org is the website. Following on social media, either Women's Brains or looking at more the sort of younger generation lens, Brain Suite. So BARAINSUITE.
Okay.
Yeah. Lots of
Excellent.
There's so much good stuff out there, Erin. Like it's just I could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. This was amazing. Thanks for taking the time. I know how busy you are. I know you've got a lot going on. This has been such a cool opportunity. We've talked a little bit about the course that'll be coming out. What are the modules that you worked on, and what was your favorite part about the course before we wrap up for the day?
Yeah, so I was involved in helping with the cognitive decline section, sort of normal aging versus not normal aging and what to look out for. Also, advising on alcohol and alcohol use and the impact of alcohol on the brain were the two that I took on. And I think my favorite part, honestly, this podcast has been so fun to sit and chat about it. I've loved it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It's been so cool for me, like just sitting and soaking in all of this knowledge. And then also as someone who just loves learning and synthesizing things, I'm a former professor. So being able to bring together all of the research and try to make sense of it for folks who aren't in academia and just want to understand, like, what does this mean for me has been so fun. So thank you for taking the time. If you have, any other additions or anything to add in the show notes, feel free to let us know and we'll drop them. We'll drop the other resources in the show notes so folks can listen. And thank you for being here. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Feisty people. CEO Sara Gross here. I want to tell you about my favorite product for muscle strength and recovery, which has also become a favorite amongst all of my friends at CrossFit. Prevenex's Muscle Health Plus. A few months ago, I started using it during my lifting sessions. We call it red juice at CrossFit, and it has helped my power, speed, and I've even put on some muscle mass, which has typically been really, really hard for me as an ex-endurance athlete. Muscle Health Plus contains creatine monohydrate, of course, but it also contains branched-chain amino acids and essential amino acids, plus some even more cutting-edge ingredients like HMB and estrogen, all of which are scientifically shown to increase muscle growth, recovery, and strength. So basically, it's a convenient, all-in-one formula that goes way beyond creatine alone. Unlike most supplement brands, Prevenex tests everything with pharmaceutical-grade precision, and they also offer a 100% money-back guarantee. Try Muscle Health Plus today, and you can get 15% off your first order with the code PERFORMANCE at Prevenex.com. That's PERFORMANCE for 15% off at Prevenex.com. Hey Feisties, it's Sarah, just jumping in here to remind you about the pre-sale discount on our Feisty Brain Power course, featuring the experts on this podcast series and more. If you want to dive in deeper on what you're learning in this podcast, and if you want practical strategies for optimizing your brain health through your lifespan, and get a $50 discount, just click the link in the show notes of this episode. Okay, back to the podcast. Okay, Erin, I'm keen to hear from you. What was your favorite takeaway from that?
Oh gosh, there are so many. As you could tell, we both got really excited during that conversation. I think one of my biggest takeaways was just naming, this is something that Kat also said, was, the importance of keeping your brain engaged. And so how are we spending our downtime? Like, what's the stimulation that we're taking in our day-to-day environment? And it's made me, just in the past 24 hours, be more intentional about what am I taking in and how am I using my brain? For example, reading a hard copy book versus scrolling through Instagram, right?
Right.
It's like, how am I using that and how might it be helping or not helping me?
Yeah, it made me think of, there was an episode that Celine Yeager did of Hit Play Not Pause, which is another Feisty podcast, where she interviewed some women in their 50s who do hip hop. And one of the points that Celine made was that actually, if we're doing something that's cognitively stimulating, like learning a dance, right? And then alongside actually physically moving, it's actually even more beneficial for our brains, you know?
Interesting.
So
Yep.
when she said it, she wasn't talking about dance when she said it. So at first you're imagining like people doing Sudoku puzzles while like walking down a trail.
Totally.
Like how does this work, right?
Yes.
And then I realized, oh no, like this is actually, like I can even count hip hop as like brain training, as if
Yes.
as if doing a weekly hip hop adult class wasn't already fun enough.
Right.
I just like, I kind of love that. And now there's like a whole new meaning to learning those dance at the choreography, which actually is, as someone who's almost 50 now, like getting more difficult, you know?
I bet. Yeah. And it's also so cool because like as a sports psychologist, we talk a lot about mental imagery and visualization. And after this conversation made it so much easier for me to connect more dots and being like, oh my gosh, that's literally how the brain is working. It's that neuroplasticity and making these connections, making them easier and easier, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I really liked during the podcast, I think it was you who made the analogy of neuroplasticity being like sleds on a slope, like a snowy slope. So, you know, the more that you do something or reinforce something, it's getting easier you know, to slide down that slope.
Yes.
But I was wondering, like, from in your experience, like as a psychologist, what are some examples of how we create more of those like sled runs in our mind?
Yes. Oh, yes. So think of it like basically as many you can think of it as weightlifting, frankly, and getting another rep in. So we can use the example of mindfulness meditation. So let's say someone is working on mindfulness meditation for the first time or the 10th or even 100th, you know, still kind of getting started, getting into the swing of things. It feels a little clunky. You get really distracted. You're like, what's the point of this? Am I doing this right? You have a lot of chatter. And every time you notice that chatter and bring yourself back to the breath or the moment or the guidance, whatever it is you're focusing on, that counts as a rep. And so every time you take a rep, you're strengthening those neural pathways and those connections and making it easier for your brain to do the thing in the real world when you're not meditating, right? So I'll give you an example. So let's say I am getting ready for a race and I'm really revved up and really anxious and my heart skips a beat or my stomach flips. Instead of me being like, oh my gosh, I'm not supposed to feel this way. I'm so anxious right now. Because I regularly practice meditation or mindfulness activities, breathing, I'm able to instead respond with like, oh, that's interesting. I must be really anxious right now. So it's like gives you more time to kind of respond.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And what I say to my clients is we can't just bring those tools into a race. So don't wait until you're anxious to work on these strategies. You have to bring them into lower stakes environments and practice because it takes a lot of time to get those reps in and make it easier to do the thing more automatically. Right?
Oh, that's so good. You know, I'm often advising people if they ask, hopefully I don't advise people when they don't ask, but like on trying to create a gap between what you're feeling and then how you're reacting to that feeling,
Yes.
you know, or vice versa. Like something happens and your reaction, you know,
Yep.
or your feeling about it.
Yep.
And it's really difficult for me to describe how you change that, like how you kind of become less reactive in the moment and more sort of attuned with your emotions and responding in a way that you want to instead of in a way that is a little more out of control. Do you understand what I mean?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. And so now just understanding that neuroplasticity piece, it means, okay, like I can train my brain using repetitions like I would in the gym.
Yep.
Like just bringing yourself back.
Yep. Speaking
Right.
languages is another very classic example. So an example of that is, you know, it might be easier for some people to write or read, but then speaking it is more difficult because you have to get those reps in and you have to get through that messy middle of learning and screwing up, making mistakes, learning from them. But then eventually when people are fluent, they can dream in the other language. So that's another example of that neuroplasticity is the brain slowly but surely after enough reps can do it in a more automated manner with less effort, though it's just way more efficient.
Right. And I love the idea that we keep that neuroplasticity into adulthood,
Yep.
that we can continue to learn. And that's just so important to me. And I love learning. So
Yes.
both in terms of brain learning, but also physical learning of new skills and stuff. I love it. So
Yeah.
it's just so nice to hear okay, we're not done into adulthood.
Right.
We can still learn.
Right. Like not taking our brain health for granted, just like we don't take our physical health for granted. It's like this is a continued work in progress. And, as one of my mentors says, there are always projects to work on, right? And our brain is one of those.
Right. Right. I love it. Okay. So now that we're at the end of our 4-part series, what is your favorite kind of lesson learned from the 4 podcasts we've recorded?
Honestly, it's so funny because I often say, I work hard to practice what I preach. And one of the things I often preach to my own athletes and clients is the importance of staying true to the little things, sleep, exercise, stress management, good nutrition. And all of those same things apply here. There are so many parallels. And so my biggest takeaway is basically doing something is better than nothing, right? And so if you can take an extra 30 minutes to read a book for fun, instead of scrolling through Instagram, awesome. If you can get an extra 20 minutes of sleep, great. It's what are those little things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis? They add up over time and can create really powerful outcomes.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you said little things, because that was also my lesson. In particular, when Kat was talking about when she shared that she sometimes takes 2-minute breaks.
Yes.
I was like, I can do that.
Yes.
Right? As soon as you're talking about, and I may have said this at the time, but as soon as you're telling me to go outside and do 15 minutes and take 30 minutes for this, I'm like, 30 minutes?
Yes.
I can't find 30 minutes for anything.
Right.
Do I have 2 minutes to stand up and breathe, walk around, find some light maybe? Yes.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
And so just hearing even from someone who's steeped in the research on brain health say something like that made me feel really good about those little habits.
Yep. I think the other thing that was neat was when I kind of asked them, what are you doing for your own brain health, right? And at least 3 of the 4 said stress management, right? Is that really focusing on stress? And they're all coming from really high achieving places, right? These women are incredibly knowledgeable and very successful. Some still very early in their careers, and being really mindful of that. I'm thinking to myself, if only I had done that as a PhD student myself. So I had some hard lessons along the way. We're getting there. But again, it's those little things, and staying on top of the stress is important.
For sure. And I've had, even recently, the journey of entrepreneurship, especially when you have, when you get funding. Like we did last year.
Yes.
So we did our first investment round. For anyone who's listening who doesn't know Feisty, we did our investment round. And what that means, though, in practical terms, is that you have to spend a bunch of money on stuff that you just hope, cross your fingers, go off the best you know, is going to make your business grow.
Yes.
And eventually you cross this line where you're like, okay, now I have to show, the proof has to be in the pudding here. Now I have people who've invested and given money to my business to show that there's growth. And this stress that I have felt, it's not the first time we've made money.
Yep.
And I've reinvested it and gone through that pattern. It is the first time I've taken money from investors in order to grow the business. And so I had this extra sense of and I went through several iterations of, I need to change my mindset about this.
Yeah.
And how I'm dealing with stress. And I feel like my own journey of listening to this podcast, recording it with you, has been completely parallel with having to learn new stress management things. And it really does come down to your own brain. I think that whole story was going to this. I think that for me, it comes down to, it's not, I need to change something in my external environment. Right. It's I need to change my mindset about how I'm dealing with this challenge because I'm feeling too amped up.
Right.
So it's been really great for me to be recording this at this particular time.
Awesome. Yeah. They've been super fun. Should we talk about the course?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, here's what I want from you, because Erin, you've done so much great work on creating content for the course and working with the experts as well. What do we get in the course? I mean, I kind of know the answer to this in asking it, but what do we get in the course that we haven't heard about in this podcast series?
Oh my gosh, it's loaded. It is so cool. So We had to be really intentional in like basically selecting topics for each of the subject matter experts for this series, right? And so there are so many things we weren't able to touch on. And so think of these 4 episodes are kind of a preview of the foundational concepts that we talk about in the course, kind of like a teaser. The first couple of modules are really talking about a woman's brain, hormonal health, healthy aging, and brain protection, some of the things that we talked about in the past 4 conversations. And then we start to dive a lot deeper into specific or special topics. So we talk about concussions and brain protection and brain recovery, for example. It's no longer the days of brain rest, where you put sunglasses on and you avoid the sun and like don't do anything, don't exercise, don't increase heart rate. So we talk about some of those myths and how the science is changing because it's changing really quickly. We also talk about ADHD, autism, and neurodivergence and how that shows up in women. Again, a huge conversation that we're seeing more of. And then we talk about mental health, anxiety, and trauma, and how those mental health concerns affect the brain, including the brain's structure, and what's happening with the little chemical messengers, the neurotransmitters, and then what we can do to help with that, right? So similar to what Laura was saying earlier in our conversation about we may have genetic predispositions. The same thing for mental health concerns like depression or anxiety. We may be genetically predisposed to experiencing it, and there's still a lot that we can do to support our mental health. So we talk about that. We've got a module on stress and cognitive load, especially for women who are multitasking and balancing a million things, which are probably at least half, if not most of the listeners here. It's like, how can we be more intentional so that we're using the battery's juice in a more efficient way? And then the final module is about all of the practical components. So it's like, okay, well, what does this actually mean for me as a busy, active woman who wants to support my brain health? And all of the subject matter experts did a lesson on that with like very tangible tips and pointers.
Yeah, you know, Erin, I had, this is going to seem off topic, but I'll come back.
Yeah, of course.
I had, on one side, I had a grandmother who ended up with dementia in her 80s. And I had, on the other side, I had another grandmother who lived to 107, who had her full cognitive faculties right up until she passed.
Wow.
Yeah, and just seeing those two things really, like, that was a lot of that's genetic, right?
Yeah.
But on both sides, you know. So who knows where I could land, right?
Right.
But like, you just seeing that was like, okay, are there things, because of course they wouldn't have had access to research or the same, you know, like other things I can do now to keep my brain healthy moving forward. And that's really why I personally wanted to create this course. And I think an important thing that a lot of women will get out of it too.
Yeah. Yeah. And for anyone thinking, you know, like, oh, it's going to be so technical or overwhelming or really dense, and especially all these really, really brilliant, knowledgeable women kind of writing these lessons, as someone who has also been worried about diving into the really technical components, it has been so cool to look through the material, and I have learned so much that has already changing how I'm approaching my day-to-day life. So it's going to be well worth it.
Exactly. I'm definitely someone who does things if I understand why I'm doing them.
Yep.
So that's also a lot of what's behind it. So
yeah, we're busy. We need buy-in. If we're going to spend time doing it, it better work.
I need to know why.
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. Cool. Well, Erin, thank you so much for hosting, for doing these fabulous interviews, for co-hosting with me. I've enjoyed it so much, and I hope everyone else has as well.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.